The forest was silent, save for the occasional creak of a branch swaying in the wind. It was a place people avoided, a place where no one ventured unless they had no other choice. But for Sarah, the call of the forest was undeniable. She had heard the stories, of course, stories of the trees that whispered, of the eerie sounds that echoed at night, of the chilling sense of being watched. But Sarah was different. She didn't believe in the supernatural, or at least, she didn't think she did. Her heart raced as she stood at the edge of the forest, looking at the dense woods that stretched out before her. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The trees stood tall and dark, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the light from reaching the ground. She could feel the weight of the place, the oppressive silence that hung in the air. It was as if the forest itself was waiting for something. Her footsteps were hesitant as she took the first step into the forest, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot breaking the stillness. Sarah had come alone, driven by an overwhelming curiosity. The forest had always intrigued her. Growing up in the small town of Millfield, she had heard the local legends about it. But they were just that, legends. Nothing more than ghost stories told around campfires. Still, the stories had stuck with her. And now, standing at the edge of the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something to them. As Sarah ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their twisted limbs forming a thick canopy above her head. The sunlight barely made it through the thick leaves, casting everything in an eerie, dim light. The deeper she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt heavier, thick with something unexplainable. She paused, glancing over her shoulder. The path behind her was already beginning to fade into the darkness of the trees, and a shiver ran down her spine. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger, but Sarah shook it off. It was just her imagination, she told herself. The forest was just a forest, nothing more. Suddenly, she heard it, a soft rustling sound, like the faintest whisper. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. It came from deep within the trees, from the shadows that seemed to move on their own. She stood there for a moment, listening, but the forest had gone silent again. Her heartbeat quickened. She turned her head, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself. "It's just the wind." But as she took another step forward, the whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't a wind or a bird or any natural sound she could recognize. The trees themselves seemed to be murmuring, speaking in voices she couldn't understand. The sound was soft but persistent, a gentle rustling that seemed to carry a message. She stopped again, her eyes darting around the forest, searching for any sign of movement. But all she saw were the trees, tall, dark, and still. There was something unsettling about them, something unnatural. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on her, and her skin prickled with unease. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and suddenly, Sarah felt a chill run through her. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and the sense of being watched intensified. She tried to move forward, but her legs felt heavy, like the ground beneath her feet was pulling her down. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves, but there was no breeze. The trees swayed, their branches creaking and groaning, but Sarah could feel no wind touching her face. The whispers turned into low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to swirl around her, echoing in her ears. Her breath came faster as she quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. The forest was alive with sound now, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. She could no longer ignore the growing dread that settled in her chest. She turned back to look over her shoulder again, but the path she had come from had vanished. The trees had closed in behind her, leaving her trapped in the heart of the forest. Panic set in. "No," Sarah whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "This isn't happening." The whispers turned to voices. Soft, raspy voices, speaking in a language she didn't understand. They were coming from all around her, surrounding her, as if the trees themselves were speaking. The hairs on her neck stood on end as she strained to hear, but the words were muffled and unclear. Still, she could feel their urgency, their dark presence. A sudden movement caught her eye. She whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. Something or someone was standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the thick branches that hung low. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Sarah could feel its gaze on her. Her pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out on her brow. She couldn't explain it, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers were now louder, sharper, and the air grew colder still. She wanted to run, to flee from whatever was watching her, but her feet wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, slowly, emerging from the shadows. As it did, Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. It was no man. It wasn't even human. Its face was twisted, distorted beyond recognition, and its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. The thing grinned, a sickening, unnatural smile, and as it did, the forest seemed to grow even darker, the whispers louder, more urgent. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and her legs finally found the strength to move. She spun on her heel and ran, her breath ragged, her footsteps pounding in her ears. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each step, but she didn't dare look back. She pushed through the trees, her vision blurred with fear and panic. The sounds of the forest seemed to close in on her, the whispers following, surrounding her. She ran faster, her lungs burning, but no matter how far she went, she couldn't escape the suffocating darkness of the forest. And then, just as she thought she might escape, she heard it again, louder this time. The voice, the whisper, the thing that had been following her. It wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was coming from within her. The whisper, soft but unmistakable, echoed inside her mind. "You're not getting out." Sarah froze, her blood running cold. The voice wasn't from outside. It was in her head. And then, as if to confirm her worst fear, a new voice, darker, colder, whispered from the shadows just beyond her reach. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out everything except the chilling voice in her mind. She stopped dead in her tracks, the hairs on her neck prickling with an icy dread. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. "You're not getting out." The words lingered in her mind, like an echo that grew louder with every heartbeat. Her legs felt weak, like they might give way at any moment, but she forced herself to take a shaky step forward, praying she wasn't losing her mind. The trees seemed to shift around her, as if they were closing in, bending inward to trap her. The whispers were still there, growing louder, more frantic. She had to get out. She had to escape. She turned and ran, her feet pounding the forest floor, heart racing. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling with every step. The trees blurred as she sprinted through the darkening woods, her eyes scanning for any sign of a way out. But the forest was endless, no end, no escape. Her mind screamed for her to stop, but the terror was too much. Every corner she turned led her deeper into the forest, further away from the path she'd come from. The whispers followed, weaving in and out of her thoughts, curling around her like a suffocating fog. "You can't outrun us." The voice was inside her head again, colder, sharper than before. It was as if the forest itself was speaking, its every tree, every rustling leaf whispering her name. She staggered, tripping over a root hidden in the undergrowth, and fell to the ground with a sickening thud. Her palms scraped against the rough, damp earth, and she struggled to push herself up. The air around her felt thick, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing down on her. She could feel the presence of something just beyond the trees, watching her every move. She wasn't alone. Gasping for air, Sarah forced herself to her feet and pushed through the underbrush. The darkness was closing in, swallowing the light, and she could feel the temperature dropping. It was like the forest was alive, feeding off her fear, becoming more oppressive the deeper she went. She glanced around, hoping to spot a way out, but the trees seemed to have no end. They stretched high into the sky, their twisted limbs reaching down as if to grab her, their bark slick with moisture. The whispers grew louder, the voices blending together until they sounded like 1,000 breathless voices chanting her name. "Sarah." She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The voice was different now. It wasn't inside her head anymore. It was coming from behind her. She spun around, her pulse racing, but there was nothing there. Just the dark trees and the endless shadows. Her breath quickened, the panic threatening to take over. She couldn't see the figure she had glimpsed earlier, but she could feel it watching her, lurking just beyond the veil of trees. The whispers were relentless, and each time she thought she could escape them, they would grow louder, closer, almost suffocating. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts a blur of fear and confusion. She had to find a way out, but the deeper she went into the forest, the more she felt as if she were being drawn in, pulled by something invisible, something powerful, something evil. The ground beneath her feet suddenly gave way, and Sarah stumbled forward, her body crashing into something solid. She looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Before her stood an old, rotting structure, an abandoned shack, hidden deep within the forest. It was covered in vines, its wooden walls sagging and decaying, but it was there. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe, just maybe, she could find shelter. She didn't think. She didn't stop to question why it was there or what might be waiting for her inside. She just ran for it, pushing through the overgrown vines and reaching for the door. It creaked loudly as she forced it open, the sound echoing through the trees. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. The room was dark, save for a faint, flickering light that came from an old lantern on a table in the corner. The walls were lined with strange, ancient symbols, their meanings unclear. The air was musty, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. She stumbled further inside, her heart still racing, her hands shaking. The whispers outside had stopped, but the silence inside was almost worse. She could feel something in the room with her, something that wasn't right. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw them, small, faded photographs scattered across the floor. She bent down, hesitant, her fingers trembling as she picked one up. It was a picture of a woman, her face obscured by shadows, standing in front of a large tree. But the strangest thing about the photo was the figure behind her. A shadowy silhouette, too tall, too distorted to be human. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she quickly turned the photo over. On the back, scrawled in what looked like old ink, were the words, "The forest knows your name." Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced. The whispers had stopped, but now her head was spinning. She felt the weight of the room closing in on her, as if the walls themselves were alive, watching her, waiting. She shoved the photograph back onto the floor and stood up, scanning the room in a panic. The lantern's flickering light seemed to grow dimmer, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. She could feel it. Something was coming. Something was approaching, and it wasn't friendly. Without thinking, Sarah turned and bolted for the door. She had to get out. She had to escape the shack before whatever was in there with her found her. But as she reached the door, it slammed shut in front of her with a deafening bang. She gasped, her hands fumbling for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The darkness in the room seemed to thicken, and the whispers returned, louder now all around her. "It's too late, Sarah." She spun around, eyes wide with terror, her mind racing. She couldn't escape. The door was locked, the windows were barred, and the darkness was closing in. "You can never leave the forest." Her heart sank as the words echoed in her mind, the cold reality settling in. She wasn't just trapped in the shack. She was trapped in the forest, and the forest was alive. The air in the shack was thick and heavy, pressing down on Sarah like a physical weight. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as she backed away from the door, her fingers still trembling against the cold, solid wood. The whispers, faint at first, had now become a relentless chorus, swirling around her like a storm of voices, each one colder and darker than the last. "You're not alone." The words echoed through the room, their source impossible to pinpoint. Sarah's mind reeled, but she couldn't form a coherent thought. Only fear, a bone-deep, instinctual fear that told her to run, to escape, to leave this place before it consumed her. She turned her back on the door, her eyes scanning the dark, decaying room. The lantern's dim light flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move and twist on their own. The walls were lined with old, fading symbols, some ancient, some not, but all of them seemed to have an unsettling presence, as if they were watching her, too. "You don't belong here." Sarah froze, the voice clearer now, closer. It wasn't just the wind, not just the trees outside whispering. The sound was in the shack with her. She could feel it. Something invisible, something watching, waiting. She swallowed hard, fighting the rising panic in her chest. She needed to leave. She needed to find a way out of this forsaken place. But the door wouldn't open, the window was barred, and the shack, this entire forest, felt like it was closing in around her. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed through the room. At first, she thought it was the wind again, or maybe her own nerves playing tricks on her. But as the tapping continued, louder and more deliberate, she realized it was coming from somewhere inside the shack. With a shaking hand, she reached for the lantern, the only source of light in the room. The flickering flame seemed to grow weaker as she held it, casting long shadows across the corners of the shack. She turned, her eyes darting across the space, searching for the source of the noise. But the room was still, utterly still, except for the eerie tapping. Her heart pounded in her chest as the tapping grew louder, faster. It was coming from the walls. No, not the walls, the floor. She lowered the lantern toward the ground, her eyes wide with horror. There, in the corner of the room, a small section of the floorboards was shifting. A slow, deliberate movement like something or someone was trying to break through from beneath. The tapping grew faster, more frantic, and the air grew colder. Sarah's legs trembled beneath her, but her feet moved on their own, her body taking her toward the noise despite her fear. She didn't know why she was doing this, why she was walking toward the very thing that terrified her, but something deep inside her urged her on, as if the forest itself were pulling her closer. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the floorboards. They were cold, unnaturally cold, and when she pressed her palm to the surface, a low hum vibrated beneath her touch. It was as if the entire shack was alive, pulsating with some dark energy she couldn't understand. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, the floorboard in front of her creaked, and with a sickening lurch, it slid open. Sarah gasped, stumbling back as she stared down into the darkness below. The hole was small, no larger than the size of a manhole, but the blackness beneath was endless, swallowing everything in its path. A cold gust of air rushed up from the depths, carrying with it the faintest scent of rot. Her heart raced, her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave the shack before whatever was in that hole could reach out and grab her. But she couldn't move. She was frozen, her eyes locked on the darkness below. Then, out of the blackness, a pale hand shot up, its fingers long and twisted, reaching toward her like the claws of some ancient, nightmarish creature. Sarah screamed, stumbling backward and falling to the ground. The lantern flew from her hand, rolling across the floor and spilling its light onto the walls, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to dance and move on their own. The hand withdrew into the darkness, and for a moment, Sarah thought it was over. She thought it had all been a horrible, twisted illusion. But then, she heard it, the faintest whisper, as cold and sharp as a knife. "You can't leave," she gasped, her breath catching in her throat as the air around her grew even colder. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting toward the door. But when she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the shack itself had locked her in, trapping her with whatever horrors lay hidden beneath the floor. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a whirlwind. She could hear them now. Voices, countless voices, all speaking at once, all telling her the same thing. "You belong to the forest now." Her mind reeled, the walls closing in on her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was suffocating, drowning in the noise, in the darkness. The forest was alive, and it had claimed her. She had no way out. Her fingers wrapped around the doorknob again, this time with all her strength, but it still wouldn't budge. The shack seemed to shift, the very ground beneath her feet trembling, as if it were alive and breathing. The whispers became more urgent, more demanding. "We will take you." Sarah's chest tightened, and she felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. The temperature continued to plummet, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and writhe, taking on monstrous shapes that seemed to move toward her. Suddenly, the door flew open with a force that sent Sarah stumbling back. The cold wind from outside rushed in, carrying with it the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the creaking of trees, and the haunting whispers that echoed through the night. Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran, her feet pounding the ground as she sprinted out into the forest, away from the shack, away from the darkness. The whispers followed her, growing louder, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The trees seemed to close in on her, their twisted branches reaching down like hands, clawing at her, trying to pull her back into the forest. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and move, as if the earth itself were alive and working against her. With every step she took, the whispers grew louder, and she could feel them closing in, like the forest was pulling her deeper into its grasp. And then she saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was the outline of something. Something large, something dark. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stopped dead in her tracks. A figure. It was standing motionless in the distance, its features obscured by the darkness. But Sarah knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on the figure standing in the distance. It was like something out of a nightmare, tall, dark, and unmoving. A shadow in the middle of the forest that felt more like a part of the night itself than a living being. The whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic. But Sarah couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure. Every instinct in her body told her to run, to flee from the shadow, but her legs refused to move, as if they were rooted to the spot by some invisible force. The air around her felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the very atmosphere had changed, grown heavier. The figure remained still, not even a rustle of movement to indicate it was alive. But the longer Sarah stared at it, the more she could feel its presence. A heavy, oppressive energy that seemed to pull at her very soul, dragging her closer to it with each passing second. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly began to move. It was a subtle shift at first, just a slight twitch, a barely noticeable step. But it was enough to make Sarah's pulse spike with terror. She stumbled back, her feet finally finding motion, and took a few steps in the opposite direction. Her legs were weak, trembling beneath her, but she pushed herself to move faster, her heart hammering in her chest like a drumbeat. The whispers followed her, louder now, almost deafening. They echoed from every direction, swirling around her like a storm, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. Some of the voices were familiar, too familiar, like whispers she had heard in the shack, in the forest, like the very trees were speaking to her, urging her to come closer. "It's too late to run." The voice was clear now, cutting through the chaos in her mind like a knife. She couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else, something darker, but the words sent a cold shiver down her spine. She pushed forward, ignoring the voice, ignoring the overwhelming sense of dread that clawed at her insides. Her feet crunched against the undergrowth, and the further she went, the darker the forest became. The canopy of trees above her seemed to close in, blocking out the moonlight and casting everything in a sickly, greenish hue. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and every step seemed to take her deeper into the heart of the forest, into its grasp. Then suddenly the whispers stopped. The world went completely still, and for a moment, Sarah thought she might be free. But then came the sound, a low, guttural growl, not from an animal, but from somewhere deep in the forest, something that resonated in her bones, shaking her very core. Her blood ran cold as the growl echoed through the trees, growing louder, closer, until it seemed to come from all around her. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, trying to locate the source of the noise. But all she could see was the endless sea of trees, their twisted branches reaching down like gnarled hands. She had to keep moving. Her feet carried her faster now, the darkness around her closing in, suffocating her, as the sound of the growl grew louder. It was relentless, like some enormous beast was stalking her from the shadows, getting closer and closer with every passing moment. Her lungs burned with each breath as she pushed forward, her body exhausted, her mind on the brink of breaking. Every step felt like it might be her last. And then she saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a faint light, a glimmer of hope. It was weak, barely perceptible, but it was there. Sarah's heart leaped in her chest as she ran toward it, praying it was the edge of the forest, a way out, a way to escape the nightmare that had trapped her. But as she drew closer to the light, she realized it wasn't what she thought it was. It wasn't the edge of the forest. It was a figure, person. The figure stood motionless in the dark, just beyond the reach of the faint light, its features obscured by the shadows. But Sarah could feel it, feel the presence of something ancient, something evil. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her feet came to an abrupt stop. She wanted to call out, to ask if they could help her, but the words wouldn't come. The fear was too strong, too overwhelming. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was like a shadow in the darkness, its body blending into the trees, as though it was a part of the night itself. Sarah could feel its gaze on her, even though she couldn't see its eyes. A sudden realization gripped her heart, cold and heavy. The figure wasn't human. Couldn't be. The whispers returned, this time louder than ever, echoing in her ears like 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. "Turn back." The words came from everywhere, swirling around her, pressing in on her from every direction. Sarah didn't listen. She couldn't. Her legs moved against her will, carrying her closer to the figure, closer to whatever it was. But as she took a step forward, the figure raised its hand. A long, skeletal hand, its fingers stretched out like claws. She froze, her blood running cold, her body trembling with fear. And then the figure spoke. Its voice was low, almost a hiss, and it sent a chill through Sarah's very soul. "You shouldn't have come." The words were like a curse, and they echoed in her mind long after the figure fell silent. Before she could respond, a sharp, ear-splitting scream tore through the forest, followed by the sound of something large crashing through the trees. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she turned, her body on full alert. Something was coming, something far worse than the figure in front of her. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving Sarah standing alone in the dark, with only the sound of the creature's growl growing louder in her ears. Sarah stood frozen, the air thick with terror as the growl echoed through the trees. It was close, much closer than before. Her heart hammered in her chest, the rhythmic pounding drowning out everything else in her ears. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, but her legs refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot, as if the forest itself had a hold on her. The sound of the growl grew louder, rising into a roar that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath her feet. She felt the tremors in her bones, the pressure of the air around her tightening as though the forest itself was closing in. A low rustling sound came from the trees, like something large was moving, its massive form slinking between the shadows. Then silence. The deep, guttural growl faded away, replaced by a heavy, unnatural stillness. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, oppressive, the kind that made you feel like you were being watched, like the very trees were holding their breath. Sarah took a shaky step back, her feet crunching against the dry leaves beneath her. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stand still any longer. She needed to move. She had to get out of this cursed forest before whatever it was caught up with her. But as she turned to leave, her foot caught on something. She stumbled forward, barely managing to keep her balance. And when she looked down, her eyes widened in horror. It was a hand, a pale, bony hand sticking out from the underbrush, fingers twisted in an unnatural way as if beckoning her closer. The skin was thin and stretched tight over the bones, and it seemed to shimmer with an eerie, sickly glow. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away, her eyes fixed on the hand. But it didn't move. It stayed there, reaching out toward her like it was waiting for her to do something. A sudden, harsh rustling noise filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy shifting in the trees. Sarah's heart lurched, her instincts screaming at her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the hand. And then, with a horrible, wet snap, the hand twitched. Sarah screamed and bolted into the trees, her legs pumping beneath her as she pushed herself faster and faster, trying to outrun whatever was following her. The sound of footsteps, massive, heavy steps, echoed behind her, but every time she glanced over her shoulder, there was nothing there. The whispers returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once. The words were incomprehensible, a jumble of cries and pleads and warnings. But through the chaos, one voice stood out, a deep, gravelly voice that seemed to come from the very heart of the forest. "It's coming for you." Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself harder, her legs screaming with the effort, her mind consumed with terror. She could hear the growl again, closer now, and it was unlike anything she had ever heard before. It wasn't the growl of an animal, it was something worse, something unnatural. The very air seemed to vibrate with its power. She could feel its presence, moving through the trees like a shadow, just beyond her reach, waiting for her to make a mistake. She had to keep moving. She couldn't stop. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was hunting her. As she ran, the trees around her seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer and darker with every passing second. The forest was alive in a way that wasn't natural. The trees twisted and turned, their branches stretching toward her, like hands reaching out to grab her and pull her into the dark. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of her eye, a dark shape darting between the trees. But when she looked again, it was there, standing just a few feet away, watching her with glowing red eyes. The creature was massive, towering over her with long, gangly limbs and twisted, sinewy muscles. Its skin was pale, stretched thin over its bones, and its mouth hung open in a permanent snarl, rows of sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice as the creature stepped forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it was savoring her fear, enjoying the terror that radiated from her like a beacon. She tried to back away, but her feet felt like they were stuck in the ground, heavy and unmovable. She could feel the creature's breath on her skin, hot and fetid, as it drew closer. It raised one long, clawed hand, its fingers curling like a predator's, ready to strike. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she screamed, the sound piercing the stillness of the forest. But before the creature could reach her, a loud crack echoed through the air, like the sound of thunder, but more terrifying. The creature paused, its head tilting as if it were listening to something, and then it turned. It was only for a moment, but in that split second, Sarah saw the figure, the shadowy figure that had been following her since the beginning. The same figure from before, standing motionless just behind the creature, its face hidden in darkness. The creature growled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a jolt of fear through Sarah's veins, but it didn't move toward her. Instead, it retreated into the trees, disappearing into the shadows with unnatural speed. The figure remained watching her. Its presence was suffocating, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Sarah took a shaky step forward, her voice barely a whisper. Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the deeper part of the forest. A silent gesture, as if urging her to follow. Sarah hesitated. The fear inside her screamed for her to run, to leave the forest and never look back. But something inside her, urged her to stay. There was something about this figure, something she couldn't quite explain, but it wasn't the same as the creature. It wasn't trying to harm her. Before she could make a decision, the figure disappeared into the shadows. Sarah stood motionless for a long time, her heart still pounding in her chest. The forest around her had grown eerily quiet again, the whispers fading into nothingness. The only sound now was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. But it wasn't the comforting rustle of nature. It was something else, something that felt more like a warning. Her mind raced. The creature, the figure, both had been so real. But where had they gone? Why had the creature retreated? And why had the shadowy figure pointed deeper into the forest? Was it a sign? Was it leading her somewhere? Or was it a trap? She couldn't stay here. She couldn't turn back. The path she had started down was already too far gone, and if she didn't keep moving forward, she might lose whatever chance she had of making it out of the forest alive. Taking a deep breath, Sarah forced her legs to move. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she couldn't stay where she was. The path before her was a blur of twisted trees, darkened underbrush, and an unsettling quiet that hung heavy in the air. As she walked deeper into the forest, her senses sharpened, each crackling leaf and snap of a twig sending a jolt of fear through her. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, half expecting the creature to leap from the darkness and tear her apart. But the forest was empty, silent, save for the distant, eerie hum that seemed to vibrate in the air. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, following her. But each time she turned, there was nothing there. The deeper she walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees loomed taller, their bark dark and slick, almost like they were alive. The air itself felt thicker, heavier, as though it was closing in on her. Every step she took seemed to sink her further into the forest's grip. And the whispers, they grew louder, more distinct, though Sarah still couldn't understand them. Then ahead she saw it, a clearing, the first open space she had encountered in what felt like hours. Her heart leaped at the thought of getting out of the dense woods, but as she approached, she realized the clearing wasn't empty. At its center stood a structure. It was old, ancient even, its stone walls cracked and weathered by centuries of neglect. It was a ruin, one that seemed to rise out of the earth itself, like the forest had claimed it long ago and held it in its grasp. Sarah approached cautiously, her feet sinking into the moss-covered ground. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer. There was something about the place. It wasn't just the feeling of being drawn toward it. It was the fact that she felt like she had been here before. A chill ran down her spine as she stared at the crumbling walls. She had never been to this forest before. She had never seen this place. But deep within her, there was a sense of familiarity that she couldn't shake. She stepped forward, her feet crunching over the leaves as she approached the entrance. The archway was dark, the stone steps leading into the depths of the ruin blackened by time and decay. The air smelled thick, almost sour, like something had been festering inside for a long time. Sarah paused, her breath shallow. She could hear it now, the soft sound of whispers coming from within the ruins. It wasn't the wind or the trees. This was something else, something alive. She couldn't explain it, but she felt the pull, the need to go inside. It was as if the ruin was calling to her, beckoning her to uncover its secrets. Without thinking, Sarah crossed the threshold. The air inside was even heavier than outside. The whispers seemed to reverberate off the stone walls, echoing through the darkened passageways. She could feel the temperature drop, her breath turning to mist in front of her as she walked deeper into the ruin. The darkness was thick and suffocating, but there was a faint glow ahead. It was dim and flickering, like the last remnants of a dying fire. As she moved closer, the glow grew brighter, and Sarah could make out a shape at the center of the room. It was a pedestal made of stone, with an object resting on top of it. The object was small, about the size of a fist, and it glowed with a faint, sickly light. It was a crystal, but unlike any crystal Sarah had ever seen. It was jagged, black, and cracked down the center, almost as if it had been broken and then reformed. The whispers grew louder now, almost deafening, and Sarah felt a sense of dread wash over her. The closer she got to the pedestal, the more the whispers seemed to call out her name, urging her forward. She reached out a hand, trembling, and as her fingers brushed against the surface of the crystal, a sudden surge of energy coursed through her. The ground beneath her feet trembled, the walls of the ruin cracking as though something beneath the earth was waking up. The whispers turned into a chorus of screams, growing louder and more desperate. Sarah stumbled back, clutching her chest as if trying to hold her heart in place. The force of the energy was overwhelming, nearly knocking her off her feet. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tremors stopped. The whispers faded into silence, leaving behind an eerie calm. For a moment, Sarah stood there, gasping for breath, trying to steady her racing heart. Her hand was still tingling from the touch of the crystal, and she felt a weight in her chest, as if something was now inside her, something dark and hungry. She turned, ready to leave, but something stopped her. A figure stood at the entrance to the room. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness, but Sarah could make out two glowing red eyes staring at her. Her heart skipped a beat. The figure stepped forward, and Sarah instinctively backed away. It was the same figure from earlier, the one that had pointed deeper into the forest. But now it was different. There was something more about it. It seemed to shimmer, like it was made of shadows, and its presence filled the room with a suffocating pressure. "Why are you here?" the figure asked in a voice that sounded like it was made from the very forest itself, dark and gravelly. Sarah couldn't answer. Her mind was blank, her heart pounding in her chest as the figure drew closer. "Did you think you could escape?" it whispered, its voice slithering through the air. She took another step back, her legs shaking. But there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in. The shadows were closing in. The figure raised its hand, and the room seemed to darken even further, until Sarah could no longer see anything at all. The darkness was absolute. Sarah's breath was ragged, and her heart pounded violently in her chest. It felt as though the entire world had gone silent, leaving her trapped in a thick black void. Her hands shot out in front of her, trying to find something, anything, solid to hold on to, but there was nothing. The cold stone of the ruins' walls was no longer beneath her fingertips. Instead, it felt like she was floating in a sea of nothingness. The air was thick with dread, pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. The only sound was the beat of her own heart, so loud in her ears that it seemed to drown out everything else. And then, from the pitch-black void, the voice came again. "Did you think you could escape?" The whispering tone sent chills down Sarah's spine. It wasn't a voice like a human's. It was hollow and ancient, as if it had traveled through the very bones of the earth itself. She could feel its weight, the malevolent force behind the words. Desperation clawed at her chest, and she spun around, trying to locate the figure, but there was no sign of it. The red eyes from before had disappeared into the shadows, leaving only an oppressive silence in their wake. But Sarah wasn't alone. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and she staggered, feeling as though the very earth was shifting, as if it were alive and hungry. The whispers were back, too soft at first, just a murmur on the edge of her hearing. But slowly, they grew louder, like a storm rising in the distance. "Who are you?" Sarah forced the words out, her voice trembling, but she refused to let the fear take over. "What do you want from me?" The room seemed to shift again, as though the walls themselves were breathing, expanding and contracting with each passing second. The whispers swirled around her, and she could hear faint words, but they were incomprehensible, a mix of gibberish and half-formed sentences. And then, amidst the cacophony, a voice, distinct, clear, spoke directly into her mind. "You should not have come." Sarah froze. Her eyes widened. She wasn't sure if the voice had come from the figure, or if it had come from the ruin itself, but it was undeniable. It was in her head, filling every corner of her thoughts, twisting them. "Why?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. Her head spun, her vision blurred. She was trapped. Her only escape was further into the heart of the ruin, but that very path seemed to be beckoning her toward destruction. There was a long pause, and then, in the eerie silence, the voice returned. The forest is not what it seems. You have opened the door, and now there is no turning back. A rush of cold air swept through the room, and Sarah staggered, struggling to keep her balance. She could feel something unseen, rushing past her. A presence, moving quickly through the darkness, and she could almost hear the whispers of the trees once again. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were commands. Suddenly, the room flickered with a dim, sickly light, and Sarah blinked in disbelief. A shape appeared, emerging from the shadows at the far end of the room. It was tall and thin, like the silhouette of a man, but there was something wrong about it. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. As the figure stepped into the faint light, Sarah's heart sank. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. The creature's skin was stretched tight over its bones, pale and translucent, as though it had been drained of all life. Its eyes were wide and hollow, black pits that seemed to suck the light from the room. It wore a cloak of dark tendrils, like roots from the forest itself, snaking around its limbs and torso, pulsing with a faint, otherworldly glow. And in its hand, it held something. A jagged piece of crystal, glowing with an unsettling, pulsating light. The moment Sarah saw it, the whispers in her mind grew louder, more frantic. She felt a burning sensation in her chest, like the crystal was calling to her, pulling her in, feeding off her fear. The creature raised the crystal high above its head, and the room seemed to tremble with the force of its presence. The air turned icy cold, and Sarah could feel the temperature plummeting. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and her skin prickled with an unnatural chill. The creature spoke in a voice that was not its own, but a voice that seemed to come from the forest itself. You have disturbed the peace of the forest, and now it demands payment. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. What was it talking about? The forest had been silent, just trees and whispers, until she stumbled into this ruin. But now she knew she was caught in something far darker than she had ever imagined. You shouldn't have come, the voice repeated, louder now, its words echoing through the room. The forest has claimed you, and now you belong to it. Sarah's heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear herself think. She tried to take another step back, but her feet felt heavy, as if something was pulling her down. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and when she turned, no one was there. But the weight, something was there, something invisible. It was dragging her forward, into the grasp of the creature with the crystal. No! She screamed, struggling against the pull, but it was futile. She was trapped. And then, with a sudden jolt, she was no longer standing in the ruin. The darkness around her melted away, and she was surrounded by trees again. Tall, gnarled trees, with faces twisted into grotesque shapes. The forest had taken her. It had her. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. The whispers were deafening now, and they no longer sounded like voices. They were commands, demands. The forest was speaking, and it was telling her one thing. There was no escape. Sarah ran. But with every step, the trees closed in around her, the ground shaking beneath her feet. She wasn't just running from the creature anymore. She was running from the forest itself. Sarah's breath came in sharp, desperate gasps as she ran through the forest. Her feet stumbled over uneven ground, and her limbs ached with exhaustion. The dense trees loomed over her, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms, blocking any hope of escape. The whispering had grown louder, now a chorus of distorted voices, all saying the same thing. Run, but you will never leave. Each word was a blow to her resolve, each whisper like an icy hand gripping her heart. She pushed harder, her feet moving instinctively, knowing that if she stopped, she would never move again. The air had grown thick, heavy, pressing against her chest, making it feel like she was wading through water. Every breath felt like it could be her last. She didn't know how long she had been running. Minutes, hours? Time had become a blur, but the forest was closing in. The trees seemed to pulse with a life of their own, bending and shifting as if they were following her, watching her every move. The wind howled, but not in the way the wind should. It was as if the forest itself was breathing, exhaling its cold breath down the back of her neck. And then, just as Sarah thought she couldn't take it any longer, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Her foot slipped on the wet earth, and she tumbled, falling forward into the darkness. The air was knocked out of her lungs as her body collided with the forest floor, and for a moment, she lay there, stunned and gasping for breath. The world around her spun, the whispers swirling in her ears, mocking her. She forced herself to sit up, shaking, heart pounding, eyes wide with terror. She didn't know where she was anymore. The trees seemed to be closing in, growing closer with each passing second, until she could barely see the sky above. The forest was suffocating, and she was trapped in its grip. The ground around her began to tremble. At first, it was a faint vibration, something she could almost ignore, but then it grew stronger, until the very earth beneath her feet seemed to be alive, quaking with an unnatural force. The trees creaked and groaned, as if they were speaking to each other in a language she couldn't understand. She felt a cold chill seep into her bones, and a voice, clearer now than ever before, spoke directly into her mind. "You have come too far." It was the same voice, the one she had heard before, the one that had promised there would be no escape. It was no longer a whisper. It was a command, deep and resonating, echoing through her very soul. The ground trembled again, but this time, something else happened. From the shadows between the trees, something rose. At first, it was barely a shape, a dark silhouette moving with a slow, deliberate grace. But as it came into the dim light, Sarah's blood ran cold. It was the figure, the one from the ruin, the one with the hollow eyes and the jagged crystal. Its form shimmered, like it was made of smoke, its cloak of tendrils swirling around it in a sickening dance. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, in the depths of the forest, there were more shapes, more figures, all emerging from the darkness. The trees were moving. The roots beneath the ground were shifting, growing, twisting. They were no longer just trees. They were something else. Something ancient, something hungry. Sarah's mind raced. She had to move. She had to escape. But her body felt frozen, paralyzed by the weight of the terror that gripped her. The figure stepped closer, and with every movement, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were deafening. Sarah felt as though the forest itself was trying to speak to her, to force her to listen. The figure raised the crystal, and the world around her seemed to distort. The ground cracked, and the trees groaned in agony. The very air shimmered with dark energy, a force so powerful it made her stomach churn. She could feel it. The forest was alive, and it was angry. "You have awakened us," the figure intoned, its voice filling her mind, its words heavy with ancient malice. "And now you will pay the price." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Pay the price? What had she done? She had only been curious, only wanted to explore, to understand. But now she realized curiosity had come with a terrible cost. The crystal in the figure's hand began to glow with an unearthly light, and the tendrils that wrapped around its body pulsed in time with the growing energy. The ground beneath Sarah's feet rumbled, and she felt a pull, a force drawing her closer to the figure. Her body resisted, but it was futile. The forest was too strong. Her mind flashed back to the moment when she first entered the woods. The whispers had been soft then, distant, but now they were everywhere, filling her thoughts, drowning out everything else. "You must join us," the voice said, and Sarah could feel the words wrapping around her mind like chains, tightening, pulling her in. "You will be one with the forest." "No," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. She struggled, pushing against the pull, but the more she fought, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees leaned closer, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions, their branches reaching out as if to grasp her. The ground cracked open beneath her, and something cold, something alive, rose from the earth. The darkness surrounded her, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. In that moment, Sarah understood. There was no escape. The forest had claimed her. As the darkness closed in, the last thing Sarah saw was the figure. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and she knew with sickening clarity that she was never meant to leave.